All right, looks like the internet's actually working tonight, so that's a good thing. We'll begin in just a minute, giving people a chance to log in since it only just turned 7:01. We'll be picking up in Mikvaot, chapter 8, Mishnah number 4. Oh, and the audio is working, and I'm hearing an echo of myself, and that's really terrible. Just as a little bit of a reminder, there will be a few sensitive topics in the beginning of today's Mishnah discussion. So if you are working with small children or you just are unable to bear discussions of this nature, then by all means, just go ahead and skip forward a little bit. I don't know how long, because I don't know how long it'll take us to get through them, but you can always skip the entire study session if necessary. Really, it's all about just the human body and how the Torah handles it. So it's not something that we should be too sensitive about. And I believe that with the proper instruction, you can even talk to younger people about these things and let them know that how our body works is perfectly normal and fine, and not something to be ashamed of, but just to understand in all of its wonderful intricacies. All right, and that little bit of an introduction. Another sip of tea. We can go ahead and get down to work. So here we are in chapter 8, Mishnah number 4. And for those of you that flipping ahead, we are drawing close to the end. It only goes up through chapter 10. So it could be just another few weeks and we'll be saying goodbye to Mikvaot. So we are continuing some of the discussion about how our body works. Let's just read the first paragraph here. If a non-Jewish woman discharged semen from an Israelite, it is unclean. If an Israelite woman discharged semen from a non-Jewish man, it is clean. And now we've got it on the agenda. Let's see what's actually going on here. So the discharge of the leftover residue after the time of intercourse, that is to say, it is exiting from the woman's body, can have two different effects. If the woman is not Jewish, but the man who she had relationships with was Jewish, then the discharge that comes out of her that was put there by him is ritually unclean. Now, that doesn't really affect her status because she is a non-Jewish woman. But if it were to come into contact with something else, then yes, that would be a very important thing to know. The opposite, if an Israelite woman had intimacy with a non-Jewish man, and then sometime later the discharge comes out of her from what he put within, that is not considered ritually impure. Now, there's probably a lot of questions that you're asking yourself. One of them is, why is a Jewish and non-Jewish person getting together and being intimate? That's not the point. Obviously, Judaism prefers that people only have intimacy when married, and obviously Judaism prefers that people get married to members of our own religion and faith. That's not the point here. This is not trying to moralize about who we are intimate with. It is trying to tell us what happens under different circumstances. So why is there a difference between a Jewish man and a non-Jewish man, or also a non-Jewish woman and a Jewish woman? Well, what's going on here is that the Mishnah is trying to remind us that non-Jews are outside of the realm of Jewish law. Indeed, that is why in the conservative movement and among many others, we cannot officiate at a marriage between a Jewish person and a non-Jewish person, because Jewish law is not binding. It has no hold over somebody that isn't Jewish. And likewise, they are not in a position to be affected in the same way or to generate an effect the same way as somebody who is Jewish. So let's take the example, the second part first. If an Israelite woman has had intimacy with this non-Jewish man, then the semen that is in her is not considered to be subject to the laws of ritual purity that are found within Torah and Rabbinic Judaism. So yes, they had intimacy, but anything that comes out afterwards is not subject to Jewish law because it was not created by a person who is subject to Jewish law. The generator, the provider, if you will, was not Jewish. Therefore, what he provided does not fall under the category of Jewish law. Jewish law has nothing to say about it. And since it is thus neutral, it is not something that can render her ritually impure. Does that make sense? All right. The first side is flipping the genders and the national roles. And that's because we now have an Israelite man who is making the emission. And as such, what he emits will follow his status, meaning that since he is Jewish, it is subject to Jewish law. It is his produce. It is his offspring. And thus, it will be subject to Jewish law, even though the woman he was with is not Jewish. Because it was generated by a Jewish man, it will follow the rules of Jewish law. And as such, when it is emitted later from the woman after their intimacy, it will be officially ritually impure. Okay, any questions or comments on that? Because there's potentially quite a lot that could be said. All right, I'm not hearing any questions or comments. So let's go ahead then and deal with the next level of delicate discussion. So if a woman had intercourse, and of course she's Jewish because this is dealing with the effects for the Jewish people. If a woman had intercourse and then went down and immersed herself, so she goes to the mikveh, but did not sweep out the house, it is as though she had not immersed herself. Okay, so she's had intercourse, and so thus there is a seepage from the man she was with, and she goes to the mikveh in order to reinitialize her state of ritual purity from the emission that's been coming out. But she doesn't sweep out the house. As Dr. Kolp points out, this is a euphemism, meaning that she has actually cleaned that part of her body to be sure that there is nothing obviously still there, nothing obviously still ready to come out. So if she didn't clean that area before she went into the mikveh, then she hasn't really finished the process of potential emission, and thus going to the mikveh is not going to complete the process of returning her to a state of ritual purity, because there is still more that can and will come out because she didn't clean up from that. And I see your hand, Aaron, but let me get the male equivalent, and then we can talk about both of them. If a man who had a seminal emission immersed himself but did not first pass urine, meaning before he went to the mikveh, he did not relieve himself from just the urinary system, he again becomes unclean when he passes urine. This is again based off the idea that there will still be some semen left within the urethra in that part of the body, and when he urinates later, some of that semen will be expelled when he does so, and that semen will be not something that was covered by the immersion in the mikveh, and thus it will return him to a state of ritual impurity. And Rabbi Yossi tries to clarify a little bit: if he was sick or old, he is unclean, but if he was young and healthy, he remains clean. So what he is adding here is the idea that a younger man will emit everything he has to emit during intimacy, that it will be a complete emission, but an older man will not have as forceful an emission, and there will be more residue, which will be then picked up by the urine. Now, the rabbis
Rabbi, you lost. Can you say the same explanation in a simple English?
Well, simple English while maintaining my my PG.
Light, that is difficult to understand.
Okay, I'll try to repeat it, but keeping my PG rating. Okay, so when a man has sex, And when he emits the semen, when the semen comes out, if he then goes to the mikvah, he is not yet ritually pure, because when he urinates later, some of the leftover semen will then come out later. And that's the problem. Now, Rabbi Yossi says that's not a problem. Well, it's only a problem for older men, because older men do not ejaculate with such force. And so there is more residue in an older man's system. Whereas a younger man will ejaculate completely, and there will be no residue left behind. The Talmud gets into more of a discussion of exactly how do you define young and old, because this is not the kind of thing that we can measure, and we shouldn't be measuring. It's interesting, one of the standards that applies is whether you can stand on one foot while putting on your shoe, sort of standing in the hallway, putting on your shoe. And if you still can, then that means you're strong enough, and that's not an issue. Okay, is that simpler English, clearer? Okay, Aaron, thank you for your patience. Let's talk about how these two things work.
Hey, yes, Rabbi. I had a question. What's the overall picture here? Because it seems weird that, and I know it's not clear the purpose of the law of purities, but it seems weird that if you do what's permitted, have intercourse with your spouse who are both Jewish, you become unclean. But if you do what's not permitted, then you remain clean. So is there an overall picture on, the purposes of purity and impurity and how that applies here?
So let me start with like the short answer, and then I want to get to the bigger topic that you raised. So the short answer is that the law here is aimed not at preaching a particular value set of who you should or shouldn't be intimate with or anything like that. This law is just trying to clarify what technically counts as rendering a person clean or unclean in different circumstances. So it's not making a value judgment, it's just making a technical assessment. But the bigger topic that your question raises is whether or not there is a value judgment about purity itself. And the short answer is there is not. Judaism does not consider being ritually impure as being a sin. It is something that will inhibit your ability to engage in certain temple activities, like offering a sacrifice or eating from certain things offered in the temple, like the Passover sacrifice. But it doesn't mean you're a bad person. And as a matter of fact, this particular week, as we study Amor, the whole first chapter, the whole first beginning of the first chapter, deals with the obligation of a Kohen to deliberately render himself ritually impure in order to take care of the needs of his family members for burial, to come into contact with their corpses. And indeed, the commentary points out more on this if you check out my Wednesday, my earlier Torah study class from this Wednesday, that a met mitzvah, a body that is in need of attending to because there was no one else, is the highest level. And even a Kohen who has no relationship to that deceased, if there is no one else to do it, is obligated to defile himself to take care of it. So it's not they did something right and became defiled, or they did something wrong and didn't get defiled. It's what did they do and what's their status? Right. Because sometimes it is the right thing to become defiled, and sometimes it's the right thing to avoid becoming ritually impure. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, actually, the question I had, because I knew my understanding was there was no value behind the laws of purity and impurity, but I was just wondering if there's some reason behind the rule.
Well, there's no value judgment. I mean, there's value, of course, because being mindful of our different body issues and our situation and our circumstances and the needs of the dead. I mean, all of that is of great value, both spiritually as well as communally. But there isn't a value judgment behind the laws of purity. When it's time to be ritually impure, you're ritually impure. And if it's time not to be, then you're not. And that's, kind of the underlying idea of all of Mikvaot, as our Mishnah study has shown.
Right.
But with regards to, is there a reason why when you were with a non-Jewish guy, it was okay, but if you were with a Jewish guy, it wasn't? Again, the only value judgment there is, to whom does the law apply? Does the law apply to the non-Jew? No. If the law does not apply to him, then he cannot render something ritually impure by his actions.
All right. Is there an overarching reach behind the rules of behind the reason of the rule?
Mean of that particular rule of between the Jewish and non-Jewish person, or between purity in general?
Between purity in general, and then the broader sense, and then going down to the narrower sense.
Well, the idea that there would be standards that we need to observe as part of our relationship to God, as mediated through the temple system, that is the reason. That is reason enough. That there is a mindfulness and an awareness that is built into the ritual purity system that really does help keep a person focused. The same way that we can argue that kashrut, by what is allowed to be eaten, what is not allowed to be eaten, by having that as a mindful aspect, provides a daily, if not multiple times each day, reminder of our relationship with God. And so too the laws of ritual purity. So overarching, that's kind of the main idea here, is that we have to look at the way life interacts with us, and we interact with life and death as being connected to how we also relate to God. And then each element of it, well, that's a whole nother conversation when we get into the Mishnahs of what can cause a person to be ritually impure in more detail. Because each one has their own additional facet of that overarching theme. Okay, let's move on then to Mishnah number 5. So now we are back to going into the mikveh, and we have somebody going into it, and we are going to be now dealing with a question of, is there something that is preventing the proper immersion? We're going to start off with a very simple case, but it will get a little bit more complicated as we go. So if a menstruant, meaning a woman who has completed the cycle of nidah, and she goes to the mikveh, and she wants to immerse in order to restore her status to being ritually pure. If she goes and she placed coins in her mouth, so she takes a coin, she sticks it in her mouth, and then she goes down and immerses herself. Okay, what's the issue here? Well, first, the practical issue, which is the mikveh didn't have lockers like a modern gym. There wasn't.
It's very dirty and she can be sick. That's the first one.
Okay, so that was not an issue in the ancient world, right? They didn't have a concept of germ theory. So putting coins in your mouth was not considered to be unhealthy. It was just a way of keeping hold of something while you were naked. Where else am I going to put my money when I go to the mikveh? Ideally, sure, I should have a friend who would hold on to it, but here she goes alone. She wants to go to the mikveh. She doesn't want to leave the money just sitting somewhere because someone might steal it. So, very smart, she puts the coins in her mouth. Now, she goes into the mikveh while the coins are still in the mouth. She becomes clean from her former uncleanness, meaning from the nidah situation, but she becomes unclean on account of her spittle. So here's what's happening. I'll put Rabbi Kolp's paragraph up in its totality.
What is spittle?
Her spit.
Okay.
So normally, if it's part of your body, it doesn't cause a problem. The spit that's in my mouth just now normally is still part of me, just like the blood is still part of me and everything else that's part of me is part of me. It's only when it leaves my body that it becomes an issue, quite literally in English, and meaning here like a topic that needs to be discussed. Here, however, because she has put the coins in her mouth, her spit gets on the coin, and it is now considered to be separate from her body. because it has gotten onto the coin, it's not that the coins are in her spit, it's her spit has left the mouth and attached itself to the coin. That means the coin has now is now carrying this spit, which is not going to be affected by the mikvah, because the spit is now not part of her. It is now attached to the coin. So she goes down and in the water, and when she comes up, everything else about her is fine, including the rest of the spit in her mouth. But the spit that is now on the coin was not in contact with the mikvah, and thus it is still unclean. And so it renders her unclean as soon as she comes out of the mikvah. Natan, I think I see your hand up.
But what happened? Okay, if the problem is the spit, okay, that become to be outside her and part of the coin. But what happened if, for example, if she put the coin in any of her private areas, front or back, and keep this very strong there? So in this way, you don't have any contact with anything else. Your body is still clean completely. So in that way, if we follow the rules, will she be completely clean after the mikveh?
So I don't want to get into all the permutations because I'm trying to keep my PG rating on YouTube.
No, try to do a continuation, okay?
The short answer is it's possible, but that's not the point of this particular Mishnah. Because the easy answer, by the way, is drop the coins on the first step of the mikvah. Let them go in the water with you, right? Just drop them and then get into the mikvah. And that way the coins are clean, you are clean, scoop them up and out you go. So there are other solutions that don't involve hiding the coin in the body. But the rabbis did not bring the Mishnah to teach us about how you should hide your coins in your body. The rabbis brought the Mishnah to remind us that if something is in contact with your body and it gains this spit or one of the other liquids that can also transmit impurity, then that is now detached from you. As such, you need to re-immerse in the mikvah and do it without the coins in your mouth, which again, practical solution, that's all she has to do. She steps out of the mikvah and she goes and says, oh, that was so good. I was so smart. I put the coins in my mouth. And they tell her, nope, you're wrong. That didn't do anything. Leave the coins behind. Go back in the mikvah again. I mean, it's another 30-second solution. It doesn't take a lot to fix this. So the point here is not the practical solution. The point here is to teach us that inside your mouth, there are ways to separate part of yourself from yourself that will prevent the mikvah from doing its job. Aaron.
Yes, Rabbi. Does this rule still apply if you're contaminated with second-degree impurity? Because then it doesn't transfer.
Oh, right. So yeah, there are other issues where if you are, like you said, with a different degree of impurity that will not be transmitted to items you come into contact with, then it's not an issue. Again, the rabbis here are not trying to teach about the levels of impurity. They are trying to teach about the detachment that can happen even while something is inside your mouth, that your spit has now become separate. That's really the only point of this particular section. And eventually when we work our way through the other Masechtot about impurity, we'll talk about the different degrees of impurity in a lot more detail. A reminder that once we finish Mikvaot, we are scheduled to study Nida. So we're going to be dealing with impurity for some time. Okay, so now that we have the idea of the coin and it's separating, which is kind of clear and obvious, now we get the next level of issue. If she put her hair, and I can't quite reach with my ponytail to my mouth, but if she put her hair in her mouth or closed her hand or pressed her lips tightly, it is as though she has not immersed herself. So she closes her hand or she presses her lips tightly. And by tightly, we don't just mean like you're not letting water in. I mean like how it rolls in, the way when you really tighten your lips up, the parts that are outside fold inside. Right? That's what we're dealing with here. And of course, the hair, likewise, is going into the mouth and being shut down. Well, things that are normally outside the body need to stay outside the body if they're going to go in the mikvah. So it's true, we don't have to open up all of our normally closed openings, in other parts of our body. But for this part, our lips, leave them like they are. You don't have to open your mouth, but you do have to leave your lips in their normal position, not rolling them tightly in. Likewise, your hair, if you lock it away in your mouth, even part of it, well, the mikvah is not reaching that part of it. And your hand, if you close it like that so that it's tight, well, there are parts of your hand that are going to stay dry. And when you come out, those parts are still ritually impure, and now so is the rest of your body. So you have to make sure that as you go in, you allow your body to just be as it is in the mikvah. This is part of the normal instruction process when you're teaching a person to use a mikvah, that you don't close up, you don't tighten your fists, you don't, scrunch your face, that you allow yourself to be in the mikvah and allow the water to reach everywhere that the normal air would reach just if you were standing around. That makes sense? Questions on that? Okay. Next, variation. If a person held on to another man or to vessels and immersed them, so I'm holding on to a person or I'm holding on to a pan and I'm putting them in the mikvah and I'm holding on to them up, down, and up again, they remain unclean. But if he had washed his hand before in the water, they become clean. Rabbi Shimon says he should hold them loosely, that water may enter into them. Okay, so what's actually going on here is that if I'm holding on to something, then my hand is a barrier to the mikvah water reaching the item. And that means that the item has not been completely surrounded by the water and it remains unclean.
And not your hands. That's a problem. That's why I agree with Rabbi Shimon. Because when you hold something, also that's why we cannot have any ring, anything, because when you hold something, also the water cannot surround completely your hands. It's both directions.
Well, right. But here the image is kind of like a person standing on the edge and leaning into the mikvah and dunking something. So the issue is that. Now, what happens when you wash the hand before? Well, if you've washed the hand before, then the water that's on your hands now becomes a conduit for the person that's being touched. Because like we talked about before, with the person standing in the mikvah and the water on them is joined to the water of the mikvah to make the proper amount, if your hands are already wet with the mikvah water, then that becomes a link to the mikvah water and it's okay. Now, Rabbi Shimon says,
if the water is from the mikveh.
Yes, from the mikveh. Yes.
Because if not, the water is the one that conducts impurity.
Exactly right. If you're washing it in the animal water, then you haven't done anything. But this is the mikveh water that's being used, and it becomes like an electric conduit, conductor. That's the word I'm looking for the water of the mikveh.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Is the rules on washing your hands relaxed on whether or not it has to be mikveh water?
Well, it has to be water of the mikveh, so that as the water in the mikveh touches the item being purified, that it's going through mikveh water.
All right. I thought there was a situation where they relax it for washing your hands, which is why you can use water from the sink at like Passover and stuff.
Oh, you mean like netilat yadayim?
Yes.
Right, but that's remember when we studied netilat yadayim, that's a different type of purity concern. Netilat yadayim has its own unique set of rules, which are different than what we're talking about here.
All right. I thought I was talking about something similar to that here, because I thought when you get away from netilat yadayim, then you're either pure or impure, and you can't just purify one part of your body. with that exception.
Well, exactly right. But the type of purification that happens with Netilat Yadayim is not exactly the same as what happens in a mikvah.
All right.
And here, the person who washed his hands and then did the submersion, the person would not be considered ritually pure. Their hands would be considered ritually pure for Netilat Yadayim purposes, but they wouldn't be ritually pure for like eating the Passover sacrifice purposes, unless they were already ritually pure before they did this. Now, what's the practical implication of all of this? Well, actually, I have been part of doing a mikvah for another person quite a few times. For when you convert a child, especially a baby, this is the process that's needed. The parent will take the baby into the water, and then they will take them down and they will let go for a brief second so that the water completely surrounds the child, and then they come up. Now, could they have just had their hands are already wet in the water of the mikveh? Could we rely upon that opinion? Yes. But halakha l'maaseh, the halakha that we follow these days is stricter, because we don't want there to be any questions about whether or not really they had enough water or their hands were the right amount of loose or not loose. So we just let go completely, so the water completely surrounds the child, and then they grab them again. But it's just, go. There's no danger of the child disappearing.
But what happens if the person is, how you say in English, handicapped, and really like completely handicapped, like really like need to be in a chair all the time and everything else, okay? I need to drop to the mikveh, is sitting in a chair because his legs or whatever. Think the worst case, okay? All the body is non-functional, okay?
Right.
So they need to be in contact with the chair or with everything else. What's happening in this situation?
Okay, so first of all, I mean, I don't know yet of anybody that would be like on full life support as an issue, because even somebody that is quadriplegic, that can't walk or use their hands or use their head, they can still be lifted from their chair when they're taking a normal bath or doing other types of things. Most people that are that type of handicap still sleep in a bed. They don't sleep in their chair. So as long as they can be removed from the bed, removed from the chair, then they can have an attendant or an assistant or multiple help them into the mikvah and to handle the immersion. So that's not an issue.
For 1 second without any
it's just the blink of an eye. It doesn't have to be any amount of time. Now, if somebody was hooked up to a heart machine and there was no way to unplug them without killing them, then, in that circumstance, it might be hard for them to convert to Judaism or to become ritually pure if they were already Jewish and needed to do so for some reason. But I have not yet heard of that kind of situation where a person was, 24/7 attached to a machine, like an iron lung situation. And if something came up, then yes, we could investigate if there was a way to make it work. But there are certain circumstances where it just won't work. Let me just give you an example that it's not a mikveh example, but imagine a person comes and says, Rabbi, I want to convert to Judaism, but I cannot be circumcised. If I am circumcised, if the doctor cuts me, I will die. And the doctor was clear that this is a real medical condition, that this is absolutely no possible way to ever have them be circumcised without killing them. They can't become Jewish then. They cannot convert. Brit Milah is a fundamental requirement of becoming Jewish. And if there is a physical impediment, then they can't. Now, the circumstances is different if they are born Jewish and for some reason they have a medical prohibition on being circumcised. Of course, if you are born Jewish, you are Jewish whether you had a Brit Milah or not. And even if you didn't have a reason not to, just your parents forgot or whatever, when you become old enough, you can have that circumcision on your own. but you're still Jewish the entire time. But if you're not Jewish yet, then becoming Jewish is only through the process of Brit Milah. That is a required step. And that is something that I have had colleagues talk about, that they have had certain, usually elderly people or people with hemophilia, that it was not something that they were capable of doing. And that can be sometimes a very painful conversation to say there isn't a path forward because of this medical problem.
Because I was thinking when I asked the question, for example, people that were in a ventilator during the COVID, and the family was afraid that maybe will pass away, which died, and they wanted to be maybe clean, ritually clean, or maybe what was the name of this scientific astroscientific British that communicate with her voice, writing. He was anti-Israel, with
I'm not sure who you mean.
Hawkins.
Oh, Stephen Hawking.
Yeah, Stephen Hawking. Like someone like him, for example, okay, that really cannot move anything.
Right.
Okay,
So Stephen Hawking is more, it would not be much of an issue. Somebody on a ventilator is a much bigger issue. And you're right, it could be that a person had been studying to convert and everything was done. They had finished Beit Din, they had finished Brit Milah. The only thing left was going to the mikvah. And on the day they were supposed to go, they are hit by a bus. And now they're in the hospital and they're not sure if they're going to live or die. And we take them to the mikvah with all of the equipment attached to them. And the answer is probably no. Probably no. Like I said, each person, each case is different, but sometimes the answer is no. And that's always a hard part for people to understand, that as open and as flexible as Judaism is for so many things, sometimes the answer is no, that we can't find a way to make that work. And that can be hard news to give to somebody. But sometimes that is the answer. But each case is different, and we can come up with 1,000 hypotheticals with 1,000 different answers. But yeah, sometimes the answer will be no. All right, and then we get to something very important to all of us. The hidden or wrinkled parts of the body do not need that the water should enter into them. So imagine a person that is has a lot of folds in their skin, whether it be because of weight or age or just the way their body is built. And those wrinkles and fold are just normal parts of who the person is. When they go to the mikvah, they don't have to move every part of their body to try and make sure the water goes everywhere while they're underwater. I mean, first of all, there's a practical impossibility, because if you're underwater, you're not down there for very long, and trying to get everything would be very hard. And then there would be a concern that you missed something. But again, it comes back to our usual rule of thumb that we talked about at the beginning of this Mishnah. If it's part of the skin that is normally hidden, then the water doesn't have to touch it. Just like other more intimate parts, but even the wrinkles of our skin that have come with age or weight or other reasons, we don't have to move them aside. That's why, like I said, the inner part of the lips, the inside of your mouth, you don't have to be worried. You don't have to like spread your mouth or your eyelids to get the water there. And the rest of our body is the same way. If it's normally something that is usually exposed and seen by just normal moving, then yeah, you need to make sure, like your hands, that you leave them loose. But these other hidden or wrinkled parts, you don't need to be worried about. Okay. And chapter 9 is going to continue with that kind of topic, which is, what are the things that block the immersion? Meaning, what is something that might come between me and the water? The whole principle of mikvah is that the water will touch all of me simultaneously-ish. We don't need to be down to the microsecond, but that I will be enveloped in the water. And there are things that will keep the water from touching me. And some of them will mean that my immersion didn't count, that it was not a valid immersion. So obviously, some of it is obviously some of it's obvious. Good English, thank you. Obviously, some of these would be very clear. If I go into the mikvah with one arm completely covered in plastic, wrapped up in saran wrap, like maybe I have a broken arm and I'm trying to protect the cast, then clearly the water is not touching that part of my arm. And as such, the immersion is not going to be valid as a ritual immersion. But the Mishnah is going to focus more on things that we might be, well, kind of, sort of. So bear in mind, any obvious foreign substance that's just added to your body for whatever reason, and that's a block. What about these other things? The following block, meaning they block immersion, in the case of a person, meaning if it's a person that's being immersed, we'll talk about items when we get to chapter 10. Threads of wool, threads of flax, and ribbons on the heads of girls. So if there are threads that you've wrapped around your wrist, if there are, whether they are wool or flax, which are both natural substances, which are very water permeable, doesn't matter, because they are still going to block the water, even just a little bit, and that means the immersion is not valid. Likewise, a ribbon that's done up in your hair is also something that will block. Even though it's just holding part of your hair, it's still preventing the water from going everywhere with ease. And as the Talmud discusses, they're only talking about ribbons for girls because they were more likely to be wearing things in their hair. If a guy is wearing them, like my ponytail scrunchie or band or whatever you call these things, if a guy is wearing that, it's still not valid either. So the girl element here is not a significant detail. Yes, Natan.
What about very, very thick oil on your body?
Thick what?
Oil.
I can't quite hear the word there.
Oil.
Oil. If you have very thick oil on your body, then that is still a foreign substance. You wash it off before you go into the mikvah. Or do you mean oil like your own skin oil?
No, like for example, I don't know, sun protection, sun protector, or something
right.
very, very thick.
So yeah,
that can prevent your body being directly in touch with the water.
Exactly. So if you are like covered in makeup, for example, or suntan lotion, or other types of things like that, that is a problem for the mikvah. Which again, when I give instructions to people about using the mikvah, I tell them, today is not your makeup day, right? Make sure you're not wearing any makeup when you go into the mikvah. So yeah, that is something that can block it. But if it's your natural like sweat, that's not such an issue. You're just a very oily person because of your own body. That's not a problem. But we'll talk about those. We're going to talk about some of the border cases when we get to the next part. And Rabbi Yehuda says, those of wool or of hair do not interpose because water enters through them. Now, generally speaking, people read this as Rabbi Yehuda losing, but the sages agree that if you have other things made out of hair, like for example, if you have a bit of hair that's tied around your wrist, that is okay. That while we don't want our hair to be tight, we do recognize that the water has to go through the hair to reach the head, and that is considered normal and possible. And so if we have hair like other places, then we don't consider that to be a barrier either. Even if the hair has been taken off and turned into some other process. That's why you don't have to shave your head when you go to the mikvah, even if you're somebody with a huge head of hair. Okay. However, let's talk about this in a little bit more detail. The matted hair on the heart and on the beard and on a woman's hidden parts, or pus, the ooze on the outside of the eye, or the hardened pus outside of a wound and the plaster over it, the like Band-Aid, or dried up juice, clots of dried excrement on the body, sorry for the image, or dough under the fingernails, or sweat crumbs, like the granules that can build up if you haven't bathed and you've been sweaty over and over again. Miry clay, potter's clay, and road clay, right? All of these can be a barrier between you and the water. So let's go through them one by one, and then we'll unpack them. Yes, Natan?
What is the maximum percentage that need to cover? Because, for example, all those examples, maybe they are a little part minimum. So what is the minimum, the maximum there?
Well, the basic idea is any. That if any part is covered, that the immersion is invalid. This is why you need to clean yourself very carefully and make sure that you're washed before you go to the mikvah. Now, does this mean we take a microscope and check a person? No, we're not worried about like microscopic things. But if you look down on your leg and you see there's a bit of dirt, then yeah, clean that off before you go to the mikvah. All right, matted hair on the heart, meaning the chest. So you may have noticed some people can get very hairy on the chest. Now, that's not a problem. But if the hair has been neglected, it hasn't been cleaned, it hasn't been well taken care of, and so the parts of the hair get bound together, like you're making dreadlocks, like you know how some people make for their hairstyle. Well, that's a problem when it's there on the chest, because that's not what it's supposed to be. Likewise, the beard, if it's all twisted and knotted up, that's also a problem for the mikvah. Now, for the next part, for the woman's hidden parts, meaning the hair down below, that if it is matted for a woman is considered a problem. Now, there's an argument about this. I'm just going to go ahead and give you the preview about why does it mention women versus men? And the issue comes up of that women are more particular. They're more careful about this. And men are less concerned with their own hair in that area. And then we get into a longer discussion about whether that is a per person decision or a group decision. But the underlying idea for just this moment is if it's the kind of thing that a person would normally want to untangle and get rid of and clear out the blockage, then it definitely blocks for the mikvah. So people don't normally like having their beard knotted or the hair on their chest knotted. And apparently, in their opinion, women were more particular about knots in the other area. And thus, if it was knotted when you went to the mikvah, then you need to go again. Now, the next list are of things that are a little disgusting. The pus outside the eye, the liquid that can sometimes leak out of an eye, not just tears, but like, you know, actual like nasty stuff. Likewise, the liquid that comes out when you have a cut that builds up around the wound and the Band-Aid you put over it, that is all a barrier. Once it has left the body, it is no longer part of you. And that means that it is now a barrier for the water touching you. Dried up juice, very obvious, it's juice. Of course, it's not going to allow the water through because it's juice. Dried clots of excrement, horrible though it sounds, some people are not always very careful about their cleaning. That would be a barrier. Dough under the fingernails, you were busy with the cleaning, making bread, but you didn't clean under your nails. That's a problem. Sweat crumbs, again, that is the type of stuff that builds up from a lot of sweat that you haven't been cleaning. All of those are a problem. They've left the body, they've turned into something new. Now they are a barrier. Now, the clay, well, the clay we actually get descriptions of. So what is meant by miry clay? This means the clay in pits. For it is written, he lifted me out of miry clay, the slimy clay. So that mud that's at the bottom of a pit, that's the kind of clay we're talking about. It's heavy, it's hard, clearly a problem. Potter's clay, according to its literal sense, meaning pottery clay is the clay that you use for making pots, and that stuff is strong and heavy and a barrier. Rabbi Yossi declares pottery clay clean, but clay for putty unclean. He has a slightly different discussion of what counts as thick or thin clay. We don't need to go too much into that. And road clay, these become like roadside pegs in these kind of clay, and one may not immerse oneself nor immerse other things with them. So the image that the commentators give is that it's the kind of mud on the side on the road that when it dries becomes like little ridges, becomes little bumps in the dry muddy road. So that is the road clay. All of that, and it's a barrier. Remember, we talked about the really, really thin clay earlier on, and as the Mishnah points out, in all other clay, one may immerse when it is wet. As long as it's still wet and runny, we know that clay lets the water go through it. That's what clay is. So it is okay, even if you still look a little messy. However, one may not immerse oneself with dust still on one's feet, and one may not immerse a kettle with soot still on it unless he has scraped it, rubbed off the black soot from the kettle. So these are other things that are more obvious barriers between the water and whatever is being immersed. Just scroll down a little bit so people can see Dr. Kolp's explanation if they would like to hit pause. All right, we're going to continue with Mishnah number 3. All right, back on the hair topic. The following do not block: the matted hair of the head and of the armpits and of a man's hidden parts. So these types of matted issues are not a problem. Again, like I said, you don't have to shave your head to go into the mikvah. Even though the hair on your head can get very tangled, that's not a problem. Yes, we shouldn't artificially tie it up, but if it is a little bit tangled just from how we live, that's considered normal, and as such, it is not considered blocking. Likewise, apparently in their time, the hair that grows under our arms is not considered something that was always kept very clean and straight, and if it was tangled, not a problem. And likewise, for a man, their private hair was not considered something that was always kept in good, not clean, but untangled. There's a whole long modern discussion about, how much grooming a person should do. The rabbis here are establishing a principle based upon the grooming of their day. Rabbi Eliezer, however, wants to make things a little bit more generic. Rabbi Eliezer says, it is the same with a man or a woman. If it is something which one finds annoying, it blocks. But if it is something which one does not find annoying, it does not block. It does not interpose. So Rabbi Eliezer is basically agreeing that some of these things will block and some won't, but he says it's not about the general culture. It's about what does the individual care about. If I normally hate having knotted hair in my armpits, then I need to fix that before I go in the mikvah. And if I don't care about knotted hair, then I shouldn't go. Then I can go whenever I feel like it. And likewise for the other hair issues that are being talked about. Now, this is broadly speaking the direction that the halakha ends up going. But the rabbis still reserve the right to make general statements. So even if you don't care about some things, if it is normal for people to care, then the rabbis are going to say, yeah, we're still going to make sure that you clean that up before you go in. So it's not quite a do whatever is normal for you. It's a little bit of do whatever's normal for you unless it is wildly different from what the community does. Okay, does that make sense? We've got a few minutes left. I think we can go ahead and hit 9.4. Okay, so now we're on to things that do not block the mikvah waters. Pus that is still inside the eye, or hardened pus that is still inside the wound, not around it, but in it. Juice that is moist, which obviously is going to wash away as soon as it hits the water. Moist excrement on the body. You know, it's not pretty, but it can happen. As long as it's still wet, then the water is still going to go through it. And excrement inside the fingernail is still considered part of you. And that means it's not a barrier. And a dangling fingernail or the downy hair of a child. So even though these are things that are kind of different and between you and the water, they're also part of you. And as such, they don't block the water from reaching you. And yeah, we just have to remember that the rabbis are not saying all of these are normal. In the ancient world, in the community, in the normal community, most people did try to keep their body clean and especially free of excrement and all of that kind of stuff. But as we've seen over and over again in our Mishnah studies, the rabbis often have to handle the worst case scenario. And if you're the rabbi at the mikveh and someone comes and says, "Rabbi, can I go in?" You examine them and these are the rules. Not a great job, I think. All right, let's go ahead and continue. These are not liable to uncleanness and do not cause uncleanness. So in addition to not blocking, they also give us this additional rule that those things do not act as a transmitter for ritual impurity one way or the other. So if I have my dangling fingernail and somebody touches it that is ritually impure, that dangling fingernail does not conduct their impurity to me. So I remain ritually pure, even though they touched me, because it's only kind of sort of me. Now, that's kind of a loophole, because it's kind of sort of me and enough to allow the mikveh to clean me, but it's kind of sort of me, but not enough to allow me to become ritually impure. Or if I'm the ritually impure person and I touch you with my dangly fingernail, I have not passed on my ritual impurity to you. It's not a conductor. And then there is one additional thing that we need to think about, which is the scab. The membrane which forms over a wound is liable to uncleanness and causes uncleanness. So even though that normal natural scab is part of me, it is so much part of me that when I touch someone with it or someone touches it, that it is a conductor of the ritual impurity. Even though it's not exactly me, because it's technically a scab, it is still enough of me to meet all of these requirements. And that is our fun look into the human body for today. All right, we will pick up with Mishnah 5, which is going to be dealing with objects rather than bodies. And then hopefully we'll be getting into chapter 10. And like I said at the outset, we are almost at the end of Mikvaot. And then we'll head to Nida, and you really have to have yourself grounded to be able to talk about how the human body works without thinking of it as being disgusting. It is just how our body works. But save that, work on it until we get to Nida. For now, good night to everyone. Thank you for joining me in the study, and I will see you next time.
Thank you, Rabbi Yasher Koach. See you on Friday.
Thank you,
Rabbi.
Oh, you're coming for the Shabbat dinner?
Mhm.
Excellent. I don't